Well, hi, and welcome to another in our continuing series of panel discussions for investors and entrepreneurs. I'm Brett Waters. I've been in Silicon Valley my entire life, immersed in the world of entrepreneurship, innovation, and venture capital. And joining me now is my co-host, Louis.
Good afternoon, Brett, and I am so glad to have such a great group of people coming together to talk about a topic that is very topical.
We've got a pretty good panel today, Louis. So Louis, I am old enough. It's hard to believe, but I am old enough to remember when it was illegal for a U.S. citizen to travel to China. And then Richard Nixon famously became the first U.S. president to visit communist China. And the State Department then opened up travel for U.S. citizens. And not too long after that, the new Chinese leader, Deng Xiaoping, opened up the economy and began to embrace capitalism, right? And what followed was a pretty amazing 4 decades of growth and economic prosperity for both countries. A lot of cross-border investment and a whole lot of economic codependency. And we now kind of seem like we're entering a new era. You might even call it a decoupling. And maybe it first started in 2015 when Donald Trump started a lot of rhetoric, a lot of anti-China rhetoric. And then the Biden administration has been a little softer on the rhetoric, but has certainly been continuing the policies of kind of increasingly reducing national security and economic risk vis-a-vis China. And that all kind of came to a head a couple of weeks ago with a new executive order from the Biden administration. And joining us to explain more about that new executive order and what it all means is Christopher Swift. Hey, Chris.
Hey, Brett. Hey, Louis. It's good to be with you both.
Maybe you can give us the 1-minute backgrounder on yourself to begin with, Chris.
Sure. Happy to do it. I'm a national security lawyer in Foley Lardner's white-collar practice. We handle international and national security risks for a broad spectrum of clients, covering just about every country in the world and just about every industry you can contemplate. And it's our job to help clients identify, evaluate, and mitigate risks that can arise from cross-border problems, including but not limited to Chinese investments in the United States that used to be subject and continue to be subject to the CFIUS review process, sanctions and export controls, which is something we're seeing prioritized in the U.S.-China relations, and now the new executive order on U.S. outbound investment. That's U.S. investment coming from the United States and then going out to China, Hong Kong, and Macau. So a set of very interesting cross-border challenges that integrate business, law, and national security in a way that really requires a coordinated, collaborative approach.
Terrific.
Thanks, Christopher.
And the executive order, you want to try to summarize it for us?
Yeah, so the executive order basically comes down to a couple of key things, right? There's a lot of hype in the press about the executive order, but the bottom line is the Biden administration is using a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, dates back to 1979, and they're basically saying the risk of U.S. investment in certain types of Chinese companies is so great that there's a national security risk. And as a result of that national security risk, they're going to be implementing within the next coming months, probably process will take between 6 months and 18 months by the time we're all done, new regulations that will say that U.S. persons who are investing in China, Hong Kong, and Macau, and who are also investing in certain high-risk sectors like semiconductors and artificial intelligence and other pretty sexy Silicon Valley stuff, that those kinds of companies will need to notify the government about their investment, and that the government may have the ability to block those investments and unwind them in the future. So the opposite of what we see when Chinese companies come to the United States and try to invest in certain types of US companies. One of the things that's really interesting about this is, for those who are familiar with the CFIUS process, there's a whole set of laws that govern CFIUS, and they're pretty set in stone and they're pretty objective and pretty clear. The laws that the Biden administration are using in this instance, they're the same laws we use to govern economic sanctions. So there's a lot more flexibility. And one of the things that'll be key to watch in the next 3 to 6 months will be exactly what kind of regulations does the Treasury Department promulgate exactly what kinds of companies are prioritized and exactly who is going to be subject to these notification requirements. That's all a work in progress, and we're tracking it very closely, but based on the way the executive order is set up, we have a good sense of what's coming.
Awesome. Thanks for that quick overview, Chris. HK, good afternoon.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending upon where you are.
Yeah, well, we're going to get to Kerr in a minute. He's in the early time zone. But HK, I believe you're in DC. You're in DC, is that right?
Correct.
All right. So what can you tell us about this new EO?
Sure. Let me just say that I'm HK Park. I'm a managing director at Crumpton Global. We are an intelligence and risk management advisory firm here in Washington, and we spend a lot of our time focused on due diligence for M&A transactions and for investments. We've been actually preparing investors for this regulation for the past few years. And I think one common question is, how did we get here? This is the outcome of U.S.-China friction that's been bubbling up in the past 3 or 4 years. The goal of the Biden administration is to close what they view as a loophole in our export controls to limit the outbound capital and knowledge that goes into Chinese companies in certain sectors that Chris had mentioned. What's interesting, this started under President Trump and was continued under President Biden. Folks may not remember, but back in November 2020, towards the end of the Trump administration, President Trump issued an executive order restricting American investment in public Chinese companies connected to the Chinese military. When Biden took office a few months later, he adopted that same executive order and expanded it. And shortly thereafter, his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, made a speech, I think summer of 2021, talking about the need to close this quote unquote loophole that allows for investment to go into the same companies that we restrict exports to.
Got it. Thanks for that, HK. And also joining us at an ungodly hour is Kerr Gibbs. Hey, Kerr.
Hey, Brett. Good morning. Good to see you all.
So where are you and what time is it?
Yeah, it's right. It's I'm here in Shanghai and it's 5 in the morning.
All right.
So good to you all. Yeah.
Well, thanks for making the effort. Appreciate it, Kerr.
Yeah.
So quick backgrounder on yourself and then dive into what you'd like to tell us about this new executive order.
Sure. A quick background on myself, and first, apologies. I've got an unstable internet connection. It's sort of par for the course here in China, but if I drop off, apologies for that, and I'll just hop back on. Just quick background, I'm the immediate past president, so the American Chamber of Commerce, so that's what I was doing until fairly recently. American Chamber of Commerce over here represents a group of about 3,000 American businesses operating on the ground here. My professional background, I'm a former technology banker with HSBC, and I'm from Silicon Valley originally, so that's kind of the perspective that I bring. And I've been living over here, been in Asia probably the last 30 years or so. Been living here in Shanghai for the last 20, and at this point, I kind of split my time between my home here in Shanghai and in San Francisco, where I'm an executive in residence at the University of San Francisco, and I also advise companies and sit on a couple of boards. So yeah.
Okay. And perspective on the events of the last few weeks.
Yeah, quick perspective, and also just on the business and investment climate over here in China. It's quite remarkable. I've actually never seen anything like it. People really have lost confidence here. The mood is grim. It's a result of a lot of different things, a lot of regulatory changes, lost confidence in how zero COVID was handled and the aftermath thereof. But also even before that, I think some of the impact of the sort of discipline that was imposed on the technology sector. And I think we've got a few things coming up. We're sort of seeing a fairly similar set of events evolve around healthcare now and some of the anti-corruption efforts around the hospitals. So there is, and then of course everybody's watching the property market, so we're watching that kind of unfold. Specific reactions to the EO, as amazing as it sounds, there's so much trouble in the market already that U.S.-China relations actually is the least of their problems. It's definitely in the background and it's on everybody's mind, but not on the front of their mind at this moment. And a lot of that, again, is the economic malaise. Reaction to the EO, I'm actually expecting a fairly muted response for a couple of reasons. One is the expectation is already baked in. So they actually had been watching this for a while, expected it to come, probably may have expected it to be even broader than it has been. Number two, the visit by Janet Yellen, I mean, part of her mission was to kind of get the dialogue going again, but also set the stage. She prepared them for what was surely coming because everybody had been really talking about it. Third, and this is a little bit disturbing, is they've almost given up. I'm talking about in Beijing now, that almost no matter what they do, they're not going to really get the U.S. off this track of imposing these kind of restrictions on China, no matter what they do. So and that's a disturbing trend. I think we would all agree that a dialogue and interaction between the governments is a good thing, and if one side or the other has literally given up on the relationship, then that leads to an even darker place. So but there is that sentiment there. So those are some of the reasons why I'm expecting a fairly muted response to the EO itself.
So, Christopher, I assume you've been getting calls from clients, who are saying, does this mean I can't invest in China anymore? Yeah. What does this mean? Well, look, how do you answer those questions?
Yeah, the answer is we don't know quite yet. The other part of the answer is it's not a matter of don't go. It's a matter of go carefully with the right kind of planning, preparation, and advisors. So let me just back up here a little bit and talk about all the things the U.S. government has done to make things complicated with China. First, there's the U.S.-China trade war, and they, higher tariffs on Chinese goods. Second, there is dialing up U.S. export controls, just like HK was talking about earlier, taking our existing laws that limit the transfer of commodities and technologies and know-how from the United States to China, and really bolstering those rules, trying to make it harder and harder for Chinese companies to take advantage of U.S. technology, even when the products in question are developed overseas through stuff like the military end use rule or the foreign direct products rule. We've seen the United States government impose certain types of investment-based sanctions on getting into certain types of Chinese public companies that are involved in the Chinese military industrial base. We've seen the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, that's the multi-agency committee, the Treasury Department, that conducts national security reviews of Chinese and other foreign investments in U.S. companies, go from 10 on a scale from 1 to 10 to 27 on a scale from 1 to 10 whenever there's a Chinese investor, even if we don't have some of these critical technology rules. And if all of that wasn't enough, they're now layering on top this foreign investment review process. So that's 6 or 7 layers of aggravation, time, and cost that you need to add when you're considering any kind of U.S.-China venture. That doesn't mean you can't go. It just means the light in the intersection is flashing yellow, and you had better tap the brakes and check your surroundings before you go through the intersection. How do you do that? You engage a team like HK's team at Crumpton to do the diligence on who your business partners are. You engage good legal counsel, both on the corporate side and on the national security side, who can help you take the kind of intelligence that HK and his team can develop and put that in a practical framework from a business perspective and from a government enforcement perspective. And then look, you listen to folks on the ground like Kerr, who understand who is doing what and what they're doing and how they're doing it and who they're doing it with. If you go carefully, there is a way forward. But if you pretend that yellow light isn't blinking in the intersection, that yellow light could turn into a red light, whether it's the Chinese government doing it to you or the US government doing it to you. And what the US government is saying with this new executive order is we have one more red light that we can throw up in the event that you're not paying attention and not driving carefully.
So HK, it kind of sounded like Chris was giving you a little promo there. But maybe you could tell us, HK, so I think this deal is not finalized, right? And so kind of who are the principal players that are going to be involved in finalizing this?
Right. So now there's a 45-day clock that kicked off that expires on September 28th, I believe, for interested parties to submit feedback to the Treasury Department. After that, Treasury will create their draft regulation, put it out in the Federal Register, I believe, and you might see the final version come out, I believe, in 2024 at some point. So who's involved? I mean, obviously the different agencies involved. There's, a little bit of different views depending upon where you sit. I think Treasury and Commerce have one perspective. I assume that Defense Department and other intelligence agencies have a more of a hawkish view about how to approach this. Another important player is Congress. So we haven't talked about the draft legislation that's currently sitting on the Hill in terms of expanding the restrictions here and notifying Congress and the government about many more sectors than just the three identified by the executive order. There's also a select committee on the Chinese Communist Party led by Congressman Gallagher, which has been aggressively sending letters to venture capital firms and others asking about past investments as well as the process for vetting new investments. That committee does not have authority to create new legislation, but they are influencing, I believe, the debate on the Hill as well as within the administration. And then let us not forget the political actors. We're entering an important election year next year in the U.S., and we'll have a new person potentially in the White House in 2025 or the second term of President Biden. And we have presidential contenders who are also making their own statements known about how they view China and how aggressive we should be towards China, which I think is also affecting the debate and may be affecting the ultimate form of the regulation.
So if anybody, if people want to try to lobby to affect, to have input on this, is there a mechanism for that?
Yeah, Treasury created an open, transparent way to submit feedback to them. I know some trade associations are asking their members to compile their views. They can submit it as a group. Okay. But I think Treasury is earnestly trying to seek feedback on some questions they haven't resolved yet. For example, how do you define AI and how do you create the red line separating the type of AI that they want to limit versus the type of AI that is okay to invest in China?
Yeah. So if I'm a VC firm or a PE firm and I want to, I want my word to be heard on this, contact somebody through Treasury.
Treasury or through the various, investment trade associations here in Washington.
Got it. Yeah. Investment trade associations may have a little more pull, right? Okay. Louis, you want to jump in here?
Well, yeah, I'd like to zoom out a little bit, Brett. And I thought you teed us up very nicely, talking about how our two economies started to come together 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And pick up a little bit when China joined the World Trade Organization in 2000. And I think we saw, over the 15 years that followed, the greatest flow of trade and investment between the United States and China than in the history of the world. Mm-hmm. And really a boom in technology happened at the same time. And I don't think that's a coincidence. U.S. technology companies need access to Chinese capital and to Chinese consumers. And I believe Chinese companies need access to U.S. Technology and U.S. consumers. We're the two largest consumer economies in the world. And to think that there could be decoupling, I think is not good for the world. And I don't think it's healthy. And I'd like to point out that there's more trade and investment going back and forth between China and the United States than ever before. Of course, there's been a giant chilling effect that's happened since CFIUS tightened up the screws 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think that when I look at this outbound investment screening program, I'm looking at the bright side. So what are the bright sides? The bright sides are I don't believe it's going to apply to any historical investments, so it's only for the go forward. Number two, I don't believe it's going to apply to Chinese subsidiaries of U.S. corporations, and all of you please correct me if I got that wrong. And three, I think it's limited to some very, very focused and specific high-tech areas in AI, in quantum computing, and in semiconductors, where I think that the leading technology development is happening in the United States. So I don't think that this is really going to have a major effect. I'm more concerned about the various bills that are pending in the Congress. that would be much more broad-based and deep. Sitting here in Silicon Valley, Brett, HK, and Christopher, I can tell you that there are a number of venture capital firms here that are focused on investing in China, in bringing U.S. businesses to China, and in helping Chinese companies access the U.S. markets. And as HK notes, they have been under fire for the last several weeks as the House Committee on China has issued subpoenas asking them to justify and to try and embarrass them and intimidate them. I don't believe that's going to work, but I do think that those firms are probably looking at investing in other areas for the near term than China, and I'm optimistic that those that are building technology will look through this and continue to feel empowered to do what we need them to do, which is make the world a better place.
Nice. Kerr, welcome back.
Thank you, Brett. Sorry about my quick break there. Yeah. Internet's usually not this bad, but for some reason it is acting up now. But I just wanted to make a quick comment about some of the things that Christopher was mentioning about the yellow light. I think that's a good analogy. And what we've got here on the China side is the yellow light is flashing, but we've got a traffic cop in the middle of the intersection, kind of waving us through. And that's the messaging from Beijing, from people like Li Qiang and others that are saying, look, this is still an investment opportunity. We want foreign investment, which they do. Unfortunately, the actions and the words aren't really matching up, and so what we've got is some challenge. And to Christopher's second point, which is getting advisors and getting advice, there's a lot of pressure right now on that sector, on consulting firms, law firms. Just a lot of pressure and scrutiny, and it's few actions have taken place recently, and one is the change in the espionage law. I mean, I think it's always been pretty clear that espionage per se obviously is illegal here, the way it is everywhere. But what they've done is expanded that to talk about actions that are not just sort of around state secrets, but expanding it to include everything that's sort of quote unquote not in China's interests. And that's sufficiently vague to give people pause in terms of how they collect information and disseminate information. That is layered on top of the existing data protection law. And that the data protection law in particular is causing issues with multinationals, which are by definition multinational. And there's so many businesses that, well, put it this way, it only affects businesses that have data. So who's that, right? So you're really seeing a reaction to that. People are very cautious. I was talking to a CFO the other day here in China that runs a Fortune 100 company over here, and he had just issued an order for all his China staff that if they travel outside of China on business, pleasure, doesn't matter, they cannot travel with electronics of any kind, laptop, cell phone, nothing. So
wow.
They're just that worried about accidentally getting caught up in that data protection law. So the environment here, and so it's both. It's the regulatory environment, some challenges around that, coupled with a challenging economic environment in terms of limits on growth. This is going to be a low growth market for quite a long time. It's very large and it's very attractive for its total size. And there are a lot of other things happening here. I think, Louis, I caught the last part of what he was talking about in terms of innovation and investing in technologies that make the world a better place. You've got a lot of that happening here. It's an incredibly creative place, incredibly innovative, but that is really being dampened by all of these different things. And so, having said that, back to the traffic cop that's waving us through, and to that point, this is not a good time to sort of come over here wandering around looking for opportunistic investments. it is a good time if you're very targeted and very clear on what it is you're trying to achieve with an investment or an acquisition, have the right set of advisors, then you are actually going to have high level of enthusiasm at the government level. So again, this traffic cop is giving some mixed signals. But if you're over here doing a very targeted investment, you are going to get that enthusiasm from the local government. You will get that meeting with the party secretary that you might not have been able to get in other circumstances. But you do need to be cautious.
So in some respects, it's a good time because you get more attention maybe than you would have 5 or 10 years
Exactly.
ago.
It could be. And I would maintain, I'm most of the, especially the foreign companies, are looking at this market as large, but low growth and low profit because the costs have come up.
Sure.
So it's going to be that kind of market for a while. I'm actually optimistic. Well, I'm cautiously optimistic because I think there is a sort of a series of policy choices that could be made over here that could lead to larger, to bigger growth. This year is going to be a challenge. The numbers, consensus estimates are somewhere around the 5 number, plus or minus, and it would be a little bit about the 5. I mean, it actually sounds like not that low, but.
Well, we lost Kerr.
Lost Kerr again.
I thought I would just jump in there. In preparation for this discussion, I was reading a really good piece in the New Yorker that was profiling Elon Musk's relationships in China. And one of the things that struck me is that they make more Tesla cars in Shanghai than I believe anywhere in the world. Yeah. And he apparently was received like royalty. And his relationship there is very important, and I think demonstrative of how the two economies continue to be very, in fact, reliant and dependent on each other, both from an investment, trade, and technology perspective. And I was pleased to read that it seems like the Chinese government is trying very hard to have good relationships with American business. And one of the things I wanted to ask her, as really the former ambassador of U.S. business to China, how U.S. business leaders are being received in China as they visit. I know Tim Cook has recently visited, and obviously Elon, and I'm sure many others. And I'm curious as to how that's presented in the local press and how they're received by the national politicians. And Kerr, you've explained to me many times in the past how you really have to look at China in 2 different ways. One is the national politicians, and 2 is the regional, provincial, local people that are looking, responsible for investment and jobs.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think they could expect almost red carpet treatment here, even the companies that are not, Elon Musk and Tesla. They can expect a very warm welcome and a cooperative government. They are desperate for anything that even can symbolically project confidence, and that's really what they're looking for is symbols of confidence that all is well. We can still do this. We can there is a path forward. But that's frankly what's missing. People here on the street, they just don't feel it anymore. And again, in 30 years of working in China, I mean, I've never felt this before. This funk. So that is concerning. And again, as I was mentioning, I mean, I actually do see a path towards better growth numbers here in China if they make some of the right policy choices. And I think and they have done that in the past. I mean, we know how much they've invested in infrastructure. Right now, I think the issue is productivity. They're going to have to find a way to get the productivity number up since they don't have the demographics going in their favor. But I'm an optimist, around that. I think with a combination of technology and investment in education and job creation in appropriate areas, I think, there is a better path forward. We're not on it now. So let's be clear. I mean, there's a lot of things going on right now that are moving in that opposite direction. And the foreign investors aren't the only ones that are seeing that flashing yellow light. I think the local people as well. I mean, the one business that's doing extremely well is private wealth management. The guys that are able to find ways for Chinese investors to move assets offshore are in a boom period right now. So that's an indication.
But I think we should be clear here that this particular executive order and the stuff associated with it has to do with the migration of private capital from the U.S. to China. It doesn't have anything to do with manufacturing relationships, supply chain relationships, any of the rest of that stuff.
Correct. Because all those other things we talked about earlier, those 5 to 6 layers of time, cost, and aggravation that the U.S. government has deliberately put in place in order to accelerate the decoupling, those other things, the trade war, the CFIUS process, export controls, sanctions on certain companies, on certain investments in, the Chinese defense sector or companies that are defense sector adjacent. All of those things, Brett, are already designed to cover those issues and create friction there. This new executive order is Uncle Sam wants to be able to capture the transfer in knowledge, know-how, right? The ability to innovate that comes with the intangibles that come with a U.S. company making a strategic investment in these sectors in China. And so if you are a U.S. company, or you're a U.S.-based company, or you're a foreign person who is availing yourself of the United States market to conduct business and make foreign investments outside the United States, it makes a lot of sense to know before you go, based on the kinds of criteria that Kerr and HK have identified. And it also makes sense, getting back to some of the points that HK was making about congressional intervention and some of the discussions that Louis also raised with respect to the Chinese Commission and some of the pressure that Silicon Valley is under. In Washington D.C. right now, we have matters of law, and the law is pretty clear, and you can make arguments based on the law. But a lot of decisions that we're seeing government agencies make, or government officials make in those 5 or 6 different areas that we've discussed, really are based not on law and facts, but impressions and feelings. And that really underscores the importance of having a good story to tell and good advisors, helping you along the way. We've had scenarios where an allegation by a congressional committee that turned out to be completely false has, led U.S. government executive branch agencies to cancel government contracts, or where a member of Congress will make a referral to CFIUS, and suddenly, one of our clients will be under a self-initiated CFIUS review, even though that client didn't receive a foreign investment. Right. So all these matters of impression and matters of feeling sort of get us into this really wound up space where knowing what you're doing, knowing where you're going, knowing what your plan is, and having good intelligence and good advisors is the best way to deal with the subjectivities and the headaches.
Chris, is it possible to litigate matters of feeling?
That may be a question for my wife, not a question. But let me just state at the outset that when you're dealing, as soon as you hang the word national security on something, right? As soon as you securitize an issue, whether it's trade, whether it's investment, whether it's immigration, whether it is product safety, anything you want, as soon as you turn it into a national security event, what you're doing is you're saying that the national security view or that lens is the most important way of evaluating a problem. Contrast that with some of the ways of evaluating a problem set that Louis just described. What kinds of things can we create? What kind of linkages can we develop? What kind of cooperation can we, foster and engender? When you look at those two lenses, you really get back to some of the stuff that HK was talking about earlier, where some U.S. government agencies are looking for opportunities to grow and develop economies, where other U.S. government agencies are really, really concerned about the way that those opportunities and connections might inadvertently benefit the bad guys within a foreign country. And those things are always in tension. And one of the fun things that'll be interesting to see over the coming months is just how does Treasury and the investment security team at Treasury, which normally does this on an inbound investment, from an inbound investment perspective, how are they going to balance these equities on an outbound basis? And where and how will those balances be different under this executive order of what we've seen with CFIUS since FIRMA was passed in 2018?
Right. Can I
So,
make
I wanted to ask you a question, and I noted that in the executive order that they're looking to regulate not only the outbound investment but the outbound expertise. And I wondered if you had any thoughts, HK, on what was meant by that and how that is likely to be interpreted in the many comment letters that come and in any kind of final rule.
Yeah, the outbound expertise is in the preamble of the Treasury notice, but it's not in the actual proposed regulation. So they're really focused on the capital. The capital, though, is supposedly a proxy for expertise. So if you're a venture capital firm and you're investing in a certain Chinese company, presumably you are, as an active investor, providing that expertise, the counsel, the networking, et cetera, to that same Chinese company. But there's nothing in the draft regulations that I've seen that refers specifically to a regulation either requiring notification or blocking of outbound expertise or intangibles.
So as a result, you wouldn't expect to see that in the final rule.
No, so I wanted to add here is that, this is the first chapter of a longer book, right? And I don't think, it's written by several authors who don't agree on the conclusion. So Congress has a say here. They've got, as I've mentioned before, draft legislation that goes beyond the narrow executive order to look at 6 sectors as opposed to 3. It doesn't have any blocking mechanism so far, but requires notification for all 6 sectors. Then you go even more, down the road in the spectrum, you see the letters from Congressman Gallagher to the 4 venture capital firms asking about past investments, asking about what process do they have to vet future investments, and then referring to a list of about 19 different technology sectors, including fintech and biotech and outer space. So, we're looking at the executive order right now narrowly, which is fine, but I think all investors should be wary that there's more discussion out there about other ways to tackle this problem, and the executive order won't be the final say in this. I'll also add, too, that we're talking about the federal level. At the state level, Indiana has already passed a law that prohibits the state pension from investing in any Chinese company. They're also requiring divestment over time. So that's one voice from one state. Iowa has a similar law, a little more narrowly focused, but you kind of see this, organic, growth within the country of people trying to find ways to curb investment into Chinese companies for any number of reasons. And that goes to one of the lessons I wanted to mention, that in doing this for the past 3-4 years, we're noticing a real, change in the definition of national security. Chris correctly said that national security is a really powerful term and is used to justify a lot of different actions by the government. The problem is that over the past few years, it's being defined in ways beyond the traditional meaning. If you question people now in Washington, the definition of national security includes competitive advantage, supply chain risk, and other factors. And that's problematic, I think, for investors who want to comply because the red lines keep changing, right? In the future, as I mentioned, it could include biotech or it could include commercial space technologies.
If I could just riff on that very briefly, during the Cold War, national security was aerospace and defense or anything involving intelligence, right? During the global war on terrorism, national security was all of that stuff plus homeland security. And so suddenly we were really worried about, who's in control of our drinking water, who can get into our, network, our telecommunications networks, who's running the power plant down the road, who's operating our ports. We've now moved from, national security, which is a world that's defined by, bipolar competition or competition between states, into homeland security, where we were really worried about non-state actors, into a world where we're now concerned about industrial security, right? We are concerned about all of those commercial and technological factors that exist regardless of whether you're a state, a non-state actor, a corporation, or an individual. And so, as we sort of destroy the boundaries that we've created between state and non-state, between public and private over time, and all of this stuff gets mixed up in the same blender, suddenly everything becomes national security. And we're looking, in our CFIUS cases with our team, we're looking at stuff that, a decade or so ago, we would never have considered as being a risk. the difficulty with having a definition that's constantly expanding is the definition is meaningless, and it becomes a bit of a political power play. And political power plays, getting back to your point, Brett, it's really hard to litigate feelings. So have a good story. Know what your objectives are. Know before you go, and bring good friends and counselors along the way, so you know how to manage these issues and get ahead of the problem, rather than, as we like to say in my practice, drive the bus to the extent that you can, rather than being run over by it.
People pay you for that advice, Chris?
They do, and I just gave it for free. I want free advice, but
Very
look,
nice.
on all this stuff, it's really easy to get wound up by the headlines. And if you look at the executive order is just, it's really not that amazing, right? It's designed to accommodate just about anything that Congress might do in the future. If you needed to expand the number of sectors, you just unplug one section and drop in some new ones. But the thing that matters here is being ready, not overreacting to the problem. And being ready involves taking into account everything that everybody on this teleconference has raised so far, and doing it proactively rather than reactively.
Right.
Just a quick comment about that, Chris. It's interesting, the litigating feelings and things like this. It strikes me how similar the American legislation and actions are to what we're accustomed to here in China. Over here they legislate feelings all the time, right? And actually there's this kind of a game over here about the orders come down from Beijing, and then they get to the provincial level and the municipal level, and they almost get accelerated at every level because everybody kind of wants to be more Catholic than the Pope.
It's very performative.
Very performative.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you've got that.
And we see some of those same dynamics in the U.S. national security agencies, or the agencies that didn't used to have a national security role, that now suddenly realize they can set up a national security unit, get a security clearance, and then those folks tend to be more Catholic than the Pope, as you were saying.
Yeah, I think you've got that phenomenon over here, and I think the business community is getting the message that now national security is front and center, and the decoupling is real. Whether you want to call it decoupling or de-risking or what have you, to what Brett's earlier point or question was about the supply chains, and that's for real, and it's really making an impact on the fundamental model of the multinational corporation, where it by definition operates across borders. The multinational company likes to allocate capacity across the way Tesla is right now. They're actually shipping cars, making cars in China where their cost basis is lower, and then they're taking advantage of the cheaper RMB and shipping those to the US where they can get more profit. All that stuff is changing, and Tesla, I think, is the exception there. Apple is the exception. Where they're actually manufacturing in China to meet demand outside of China. You're starting to really see a change in that fundamental business model, where they are isolating the China business, and again the pressure is coming from both sides in order to do that. And so again, from the China side, they have successfully sort of isolated the digital economy. We know that we've talked about that before. So the question is, are other industries going to eventually look like that as well? And that's kind of a shocking thing. One quick question, we're back to what HK was talking about, with the expertise. When I, can't export the expertise. When I saw that in the executive order, I had kind of a historic deja vu moment. It sort of reminding me of back in the day when Alexander Hamilton, the United States was developing as a developing country, and Alexander Hamilton encouraged entrepreneurs to actively steal British technology because in the United States the colonies had none, and that law was the British put that law in place with cannot export expertise, and they literally had people standing on the dock in England to prevent people that had textile mill know-how, and if they knew that person was in a position to where they had that kind of expertise, they wouldn't let them get on the ship. And so here we are, 250 years later, we're kind of doing the same thing. So that's kind of what my reaction was to that clause in the executive order. It's kind of interesting.
Hey, Kerr, since you've just given us such a great little history lesson, I'd like to give you the opportunity to quickly plug your new book.
Oh, thank you so much, Brett. Yeah, so I've put together a new book. It's called Selling to China. It's really kind of an extension of my work, from with the American Chamber of Commerce, and really talking about, what is it like to operate a large foreign business here on the ground in Shanghai. So it has lessons in it about kind of that relationship between business and government. It talks a lot about competing against local firms. So it's not necessarily a book about U.S.-China relations per se, but that is the backdrop of the book itself. It's really about business operations and how some of these businesses have evolved and adjusted to the changing environment over here. So thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, Selling to China, it's available on Amazon in electronic form and hardcover. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. So, Chris, you've mentioned CFIUS a couple times. And so maybe you could give us kind of the 30-second reminder of what CFIUS is.
Sure.
And then also tell us, how is this recent executive order different from that?
Okay, so CFIUS sounds like syphilis, just as easy to catch, just as hard to get rid of. Now you'll remember how to say it and what it is for the rest of your life. It stands for Committee on Foreign Investment from a foreign country, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. So as the British like to say, what's on the tin is what's inside the tin. Right, what's on the label, what's in the label is what it does. So if you have a foreign person, doesn't matter whether they're a corporation, an individual, a family trust, a venture capital enterprise, a limited partnership, whatever. If you have a foreign person and they want to come to the United States and acquire an entity that has assets or operations in the United States, right, that is falls within CFIUS's jurisdiction. So the first question is, do you have a foreign investor? So if you have a Chinese entity that's coming to make an investment, then the answer is yes. Second question is, do you have a U.S. business? Well, if a foreign investor wants to come in and buy a taco truck in Washington, D.C., believe it or not, that is a foreign investment in the United States. The third question then is, does Uncle Sam care about the taco truck? Well, if the taco truck is making tacos, the answer is no. But if the taco truck is an AI-enabled rocket launcher manufacturing company that happens to serve Taco Tuesday in the canteen, then we have a very, very different situation. And there are certain types of criteria that will trigger either a mandatory filing based on the target side characteristics or militate in favor of a voluntary filing. But bottom line, CFIUS has unlimited power to investigate a transaction, to modify the terms of a transaction, and even to block a transaction. That power has been tested in the U.S. federal courts at the appellate level, and the last person who tried to test that got taken to the woodshed by the Court of Appeals to the Federal Circuit.
Wow. But just to be clear, legitimate taco trucks are okay, right?
Yeah, so we use the taco truck as an example, right? Is that a foreign investment in the United States? If Louis and I own a taco truck, and Brett, you're coming from China and you want to buy a third of the interest in the taco truck, that's a Chinese investment in the U.S. business. It's within CFIUS's jurisdiction. Okay. Does CFIUS care about the taco truck? Absolutely not.
Got it.
Unless the taco truck is a really interesting.
Got something it. More. So it does fall under the jurisdiction, but it's not likely to catch anybody's attention.
But the jurisdiction is different from whether the government is going to make you do something or whether the government's going to use its prosecutorial discretion to open an investigation.
Sure.
One of the areas where we see a lot of action in the CFIUS space where there aren't mandatory filings is when there's sensitive personal data involved. A lot of healthcare and life sciences companies. We've seen a tremendous amount of CFIUS interest in that space because the concern is that the Chinese government can get access and information about U.S. healthcare information, U.S. insurance information, the state of U.S. financial, individual financial information, that sort of stuff. Now, how is this thing different? Well, first off, as I mentioned earlier, they're not using any of the CFIUS legislation. They're using the same legislation that Jimmy Carter used to sanction Iran in 1979.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a really different legislation. It's much broader. That legislation's been upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1983 in a case called Dames and Moore v. Reagan. So the government is actually asserting more power in some ways, and that power is much more flexible because the goal here isn't to set up the goal wasn't to set up a review process. Initially, it's to set limitations on what kinds of investments can occur if those intangibles are going along with the investment. That's why the really key thing to watch, during the 45-day public comment period, and once we get an interim rule and then ultimately a final rule, is how does CFIUS implement the aspirations that are in the executive order? I think we're likely to see a pilot program or something similar before they finally get to a final rule. And the final rule will probably be driven by some of the congressional action that HK has been talking about.
Got it. Okay. I think we will wrap this up in the next 5 minutes or so. So, Louis, additional topics that you think we should try to get in the next 5 minutes?
Well, I think what we're likely to see in the next 3 to 4 months before we have a final rule is I expect as a lawyer in Silicon Valley who represents emerging growth companies and venture capital firms trying to make investments, as whether it's okay to proceed. And together with my partner Christopher, we have been navigating this for some time. And one of the things we do, Brad, is we look to find out whether the company's technology is what we call a TID business. And if the company is unable to rep that it's not a TID business, then we look to ask the investors to certify that they are U.S. persons, or if they're not, what they are. And Christopher and I have been navigating that for some time, and I expect that it's going to be business as usual in that regard. Christopher, when we look at these transactions, tell us a bit about what's a TID business.
Yeah, so on the standard CFIUS stuff, and this is current state of play, it's not where the executive order will go. On the current CFIUS side, we look at, it's the taco truck question. How interesting is that taco truck? Does that taco truck have critical technology? Well, guess what? All of the sectors that have been identified for the outbound investment issue, for prioritization with the outbound investment executive order, they are already folded into the CFIUS process as critical technology. Second thing we look at is critical infrastructure, right? That gets us back to that homeland security stuff of the Russians running the power plant, to the North Koreans have access to our water, right? So critical infrastructure sort of stuff. Proximity to military bases is another issue. And then finally, as we were mentioning earlier, sensitive personal data. That can be financial and insurance data, but more and more and more, it is healthcare data. It is, geolocation data. It's the kind of stuff that would give a foreign government insight into a particular individual or people inside a government agency who might be employees of a government agency. Or in some instances, we're aware of cases where, CFIUS intervened because the Department of Defense determined that the kind of information that a particular company might have would actually serve as an early indicator as to whether a Navy ship was about to deploy.
Yeah.
So that TID stands for technology, infrastructure, critical technology, critical infrastructure, critical data, sensitive personal data. Right now on the outbound side, with these new executive order, we're only seeing a focus on critical technology, but based on everything that HK is tracking up on the Hill, and some of the other stuff we've seen develop in the CFIUS space over the last 5 years, it would not surprise me that the final chapter of the story brought infrastructure and data issues in much the same way we currently see with the CFIUS process.
That's a great segue, as I wanted to ask HK, how HK, you work with a lot of U.S. investment funds and endowments and corporations, giving them advice on how to look at their portfolio. How has your advice evolved in the last several weeks in light of the executive order about what they should be anticipating next and what they should be doing now?
Yeah, thanks. So the draft or expected Treasury regulation will be narrow, as we talked about, focused on active investors and those three sectors. But we warn them that the executive order is only the one element to worry about, right? I think the broader risk here is reputational risk. Outside the executive branch, the public is now scrutinizing whether pensions or endowments or foundations have made indirect investments in what they deem to be problematic companies. The problem is that the public is defining what problematic is. It can be defined by a politician, an NGO, the media, or even a blogger, depending upon how they define it. So, for example, the executive orders focus on national security, not human rights or Xinjiang, but a reporter could easily write an article about an investment firm investing in a company tied to Xinjiang that will be technically allowed by the executive order, but reputationally hard to defend against if it's on the front page of the New York Times, for example. So reputational risk, I think, is probably the biggest risk for most passive investors.
And that gets us back to the litigating feelings issues that Brett was raising earlier.
Well, gentlemen, we need to wrap this up. I, for one, am feeling very comforted by the fact that taco trucks are all right. This has been a great discussion about a super, super interesting topic, both for investors and also, honestly, it's a super interesting topic in terms of those of us who follow global politics. Louis, you want to take us home?
I want to thank our panelists for joining, and certainly if there's new news from Capitol Hill, we'll get this group together again. And until then, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We'll circulate a copy of this video and some takeaways very shortly. Thanks again, Brett, for hosting us.
Thank you. It's been a great conversation.